At 65 years old, Martha Vance had become a ghost in a world that only valued the young and the fast. She stood in the center of a sterile, white-walled social housing room, the hum of the city traffic outside sounding like a countdown to her own disappearance. She was broke, not just low on cash, but fundamentally, terrifyingly alone. No safety net, no family to call, no home to return to. In 3 days, her temporary assistance would expire, leaving her with exactly $78 and a single worn leather suitcase. Society looks at a woman like Martha and sees a finished story. They see a senior citizen, a statistical liability, someone who should quietly accept a chair in a corner and wait for the end. But what they didn't see was the fire still smoldering beneath her ribs, a fire that was about to be fueled by the most unlikely of gifts. On the morning of her 65th birthday, while the rest of the world celebrated its milestones, Martha received a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It didn't come with a card or a bouquet. It came from a legal firm 300 miles away, tied to a mother she hadn't spoken to in nearly 30 years. Inside wasn't a check. There were no life insurance payouts or stocks. Instead, there was a hand-drawn map, sketched on parchment that felt like dried skin, and a rusted iron key that left a scent of blood and old earth on her palms. At the bottom of the map, a single sentence was written in a cramped, shaky hand. To claim the foundation of your future, you must first pay the debt of the past, $50 in back taxes. $50. To most, it's the price of a modest dinner. To Martha, it was more than half of her remaining life savings. It was a gamble that felt like madness. The land was described as worthless, located in a region of the mountains where the maps ended and the fog began. There were no utilities, no cell service, no guarantee that a structure even remained standing. People at the housing center whispered when they saw her packing. "She's lost her mind," they said. "She won't last a night in the cold. She should stay here and wait for a spot in the state home." But Martha knew something they didn't. Staying where she was meant a guaranteed, slow death of the spirit. Taking this risk, however absurd, gave her something she hadn't felt in a decade: ownership. If you've ever felt like the world was moving on without you, if you've ever wondered if it's too late to rewrite your final chapter, then stay with me. Because what Martha found behind that rusted gate wasn't just a building. It was a truth about human resilience that will change the way you look at your own life. The journey into the mountains was a descent into the forgotten. As the rusted Greyhound bus groaned up the winding passes, the scenery shifted from the jagged glass of the city to the suffocating green of the ancient forest. Martha watched her reflection in the window, a map of wrinkles and silver hair. She looked like a victim. She felt like a traveler. She was the only passenger left when the bus hissed to a stop at a crossroads that didn't even have a name. The driver looked at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes filled with a mix of pity and confusion. "You sure about this, ma'am? There's nothing up that trail but shadows and old stories." "I'm sure," Martha said, her voice cracking but firm. She stepped off the bus, her suitcase hitting the gravel with a hollow thud. The silence of the mountains was heavy. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a park. It was the watchful silence of a predator. Martha began to walk. 3 miles in, the road became a memory. Mud sucked at her sensible shoes. The air grew thin and tasted of pine and wet stone. Every muscle in her 65-year-old body screamed in protest. Her heart hammered against her chest like a trapped bird. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to seep into her mind. What am I doing? I am a woman of a certain age, chasing a ghost with $50 in my pocket. But then, she saw it. Through a veil of weeping willow trees stood a gate. It wasn't a grand entrance. It was a jagged barrier of wrought iron, choked by ivy that looked like grasping fingers. The lock was a mass of orange rust, fused shut by decades of mountain rain. Martha reached into her pocket and pulled out the iron key. She didn't just turn the key. She fought it. She leaned her entire weight into the metal, feeling the rust scrape against her skin, drawing a thin line of red. And then, with a sound like a dying scream, the gate groaned open. Martha stepped through the threshold, and the world behind her seemed to vanish. Ahead of her stood the structure. It was a decaying behemoth of stone and timber, its roof sagging like a tired brow. To anyone else, it was a ruin, a liability, a pile of trash. But as Martha stood there, breathless and trembling, she noticed something strange. The air around the building wasn't cold, it was warm. A dry, sweet heat radiated from the stones, smelling of scorched sugar and ancient cedar. The building wasn't dead. It was waiting. As Martha's worn shoes clicked against the rotted oak of the interior floorboards, a cloud of silver dust billowed up, dancing in the singular shaft of light that pierced the gloom. The air was thick, tasting of copper and ancient, trapped oxygen. It was the smell of a tomb, yet beneath it was that strange, impossible warmth she had sensed outside. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness like a blade. It revealed walls that were bleeding. Not blood, but layers of floral wallpaper peeling away like dead skin to reveal the sturdy, honest stone beneath. The furniture was draped in gray sheets, looking like a gathering of ghosts, waiting for a hostess who had been late for 30 years. "I'm here," Martha whispered. Her voice didn't echo. The house seemed to swallow the sound, digesting her presence. She moved toward the kitchen, the heart of any home. The linoleum was cracked into 1,000 jagged islands. On the table sat a single teacup, bone dry, with a dark ring at the bottom, the last sip of a life interrupted. Beside it lay a newspaper from a decade Martha barely remembered. The headlines spoke of a world that was already gone. Her heart hammered. Why was it so warm? The mountain air outside was biting, yet here, the temperature felt like a summer afternoon. She followed the heat. It led her toward the pantry, a narrow room with shelves that groaned under the weight of empty glass jars. But the floor here was different. The wood was scorched. Martha knelt, her joints popping with a sound like dry twigs. She pushed aside a heavy, moth-eaten rug. Beneath it was a trapdoor, its ring pull made of cold brass. This was the moment where most would have turned back. The basement of a ruined house in the middle of a forest is where logic goes to die. But Martha had $78 and a suitcase. She had no back. She only had down. She pulled. The door groaned, a long, rhythmic scrape of wood on stone. A wave of dry, intense heat hit her face, carrying the scent of caramelized yeast and something metallic, like a blacksmith's forge. She descended the stone steps, each one slippery with condensation. At the bottom, the flashlight beam hit a wall of polished copper. It wasn't a basement, it was a machine. A labyrinth of cast iron pipes, brass valves, and copper coils filled the subterranean space. They hummed, a low, subsonic vibration that Martha felt in her teeth. In the center of this mechanical forest stood a massive boiler, its iron belly glowing with a faint, internal amber light. It shouldn't have been working. There was no gas line, no electricity, no coal. And then she saw the movement in the shadows. A figure, tall and gaunt, emerged from behind a steam pipe. He wore a heavy leather apron, stained with oil and soot. His hair was a wild halo of white, and his eyes, when they caught the light, were the color of flint. He held a wrench like a scepter. "You're late," the man said. His voice was like grinding gravel. "The pressure has been climbing for 48 hours. I thought the Vances had finally run out of blood." Martha didn't scream. She didn't run. She stood her ground, clutching her mother's map. "I am Martha Vance, and this is my house." The man stepped closer, his boots heavy on the stone. Ownership is a word for city people. Down here, there is only the machine, and the machine is hungry. The man's name was Arthur. He had been a squatter, a guardian, and a prisoner of the structure for 15 years. He explained to Martha what the worthless land actually was: a geothermal anomaly. The house sat directly over a volcanic vent, a rare vein of the Earth's blood that rose to the surface. Her grandfather hadn't built a house. He had built a power plant disguised as a home. But the system was failing. The pipes were corroded, the valves were seized, and without constant manual intervention, the pressure would eventually turn the beautiful stone house into a crater in the mountainside. "Your mother sent you here to die, or to wake up," Arthur said, wiping grease onto a rag that was already black. "Every morning, I trade the heat I harvest for supplies from the town. They don't ask where the steam-pressed timber or the kiln-dried herbs come from. They just pay. But I'm old, Martha. My hands don't grip the wrenches like they used to." Martha looked at her own hands. They were thin, spotted with age, the hands of a retired teacher. But she remembered her father's workshop. She remembered the logic of the lever and the grace of the gear. "Show me," she said. That first night was an initiation of fire. Arthur didn't give her a bed. He gave her a task. She spent 6 hours in the sweltering heat of the basement, learning the language of the boiler. She learned that valve A must be turned 3/4 inches to the left when the hum becomes a whistle. She learned that the hungry machine fed on the balance of pressure. By 3 in the morning, her clothes were soaked with sweat and oil. Her back felt like it was being stitched with hot needles. Her $78 felt like a million miles away. When the sun finally began to bleed through the cracks in the basement windows, Arthur handed her a piece of dry bread and a cup of water heated on the steam pipes. "Why stay?" he asked. "You could sell the copper in this room and live in a hotel for a year." Martha looked up at the ceiling, toward the house she had barely begun to explore. "Because for 65 years, I've been a guest in someone else's world. I've paid rent, I've followed rules, and I've been moved around like a piece of furniture. This is the first thing that belongs to me, even if it wants to kill me." Arthur nodded slowly. He reached into his apron and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. "Then you'll need this. It's the record of every Vance who stood where you're standing. It's not a diary. It's a manual for survival." As the days turned into weeks, the physical transformation of Martha Vance began. The invisible woman was dying, and something harder, sharper, was taking her place. She stopped looking at the wrinkles on her face and started looking at the calluses on her palms. She spent her mornings in the upper house, tearing down the ghost sheets and scrubbing the grime of decades from the windows. She found that the house was filled with secrets. In the walls, she found hidden compartments containing jars of seeds. Not just any seeds, but ancient varieties of tobacco, lavender, and ginseng that thrived in the geothermal heat of the soil. She realized the empire wasn't just the machine in the basement. It was the land itself. The ground stayed at a constant 70 degrees, even when the mountain frost turned the surrounding forest into a crystal graveyard. But the town below was starting to notice the smoke rising from the long, dormant chimney. One afternoon, a black SUV, sleek and out of place against the rugged pines, pulled up to the rusted gate. A man stepped out. He was young, wearing a suit that cost more than Martha had earned in a year of teaching. He carried a briefcase like a weapon. Martha stood on the porch, holding a heavy iron wrench she had brought up from the basement. She didn't look like a retiree. She looked like a warden. "Mrs. Vance?" the man called out, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "My name is Sterling. I represent North Face Acquisitions. We've been monitoring this parcel for some time. We believe there's an environmental hazard on this property, a geothermal leak that poses a threat to the local water table." He smiled, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "The county is prepared to condemn the site. However, my clients are willing to offer you a hardship buyout. $100,000 cash, and we take the liability off your hands. You could move back to the city, Martha. A luxury condo. No more cold nights, no more labor." Martha felt the weight of the wrench in her hand. $100,000. It was a fortune. It was the easy way out. It was exactly what the world expected her to do. "An environmental hazard?" Martha asked, her voice low and dangerous. "A ticking time bomb," Sterling replied, stepping closer to the gate. "Why spend your final years fighting a losing battle against a pile of rust? Take the money, enjoy your retirement." Martha looked past him, toward the forest, and then down at the scorched boards beneath her feet. She thought of the machine, breathing in the basement. She thought of the seeds waiting in the jars. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "you made one mistake. You think I'm afraid of the bomb, but I've spent 65 years living in a world that was already exploding. I'm not leaving. I'm the one who's going to decide when the timer stops." Sterling's smile vanished. "We have the lawyers, Mrs. Vance. We have the signatures of the local council. You have a pile of scrap metal and a squatter in your cellar. Don't make this difficult." "Difficult is all I know," Martha said, and she turned her back on him, walking into the house and slamming the heavy oak door. The war had begun. The heavy oak door didn't just close. It sealed. Martha leaned against the wood, her breath coming in ragged hitches. Outside, she heard the muffled crunch of gravel as Sterling's luxury SUV retreated. He wasn't gone for good. He was just going to fetch a bigger hammer. She descended into the basement. The heat was more intense now, a pulsing rhythm that matched the thrumming in her veins. Arthur was hunched over a secondary pressure gauge, his shadow flickering against the copper pipes like a restless spirit. "He offered money, didn't he?" Arthur didn't look up. "They always start with the velvet glove, but the iron fist is already clenched behind their back." "He knows about the geothermal vent," Martha said, wiping grit from her forehead. "He called it a hazard. He wants to condemn the land." Arthur let out a dry, hacking laugh. Hazard? This hazard could power 3 city blocks if the grid was built right. "That's why your grandfather hid it." He knew the moment the corporate vultures saw a way to harvest the Earth's blood for free, they'd erase anyone standing on top of it. Martha walked over to the workbench where the leather-bound Vance ledger lay open. She began to flip through the pages, her eyes scanning the meticulous drawings of valves and the handwritten notes of her ancestors. It wasn't just a maintenance log. It was a tactical map. "Arthur, if this house is a power plant, where does the excess energy go? A boiler this size would have melted the foundation decades ago if it was just sitting here." Arthur straightened his back, the vertebrae popping like gunfire. He beckoned her toward the far wall, behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. He pushed a hidden lever disguised as a structural bolt. A section of the stone wall recessed, sliding back with a grinding groan. Behind it lay a refrigerated vault, chilled not by electricity, but by a complex heat exchange system that used the mountain's natural spring water. Inside were thousands of vacuum-sealed canisters. "The Vances weren't just engineers," Arthur whispered. "They were preservationists. These are the ghost crops. Seeds of plants the world thinks went extinct 50 years ago. Varieties of wheat that can grow in sand. Medicinal flowers that cure what the pharmacies can't. They need constant, precise temperatures to stay viable. The machine doesn't just keep us warm, Martha. It keeps the future alive." Martha reached out, touching the cold glass of a canister. This was the illegal empire. Not gold, not weapons, but life itself. Sterling didn't want the land for a hazard. He wanted the biogenetic monopoly hidden beneath the floorboards. "They're coming back with the sheriff and a demolition order," Martha said, her mind spinning with the cold logic of a woman who had spent 40 years teaching children that every problem has a solution. "We have 48 hours. We can't fight them with wrenches. We have to fight them with the law they're trying to bend." Martha didn't sleep. She moved her suitcase into the library, a room where the smell of rot was replaced by the scent of drying ink. She tore open the boxes she had found in the attic: legal correspondence from 1974, tax receipts, and original land grants signed before the county even had a name. She realized the corporate strategy was built on a lie, that the property had been abandoned. But a property isn't abandoned if the taxes are paid. She looked at her receipt for the $50. It was the key of Solomon. By paying those back taxes, she hadn't just bought a house. She had reactivated a sovereign land deed that predated the current zoning laws. But she needed a witness. She needed the town to see the ghost was alive. She spent the next day working with a feverish intensity. She used the old tools to carve wooden signage: Vance Botanical Preserve. She used the heat of the boiler to force bloom a batch of the ancient lavender seeds in the indoor solarium. The scent was intoxicating, stronger, purer than anything sold in a store. When she walked into the town square the following morning, she didn't look like a victim. She wore her mother's old work coat and carried a basket of the blooming lavender. She didn't go to the lawyer. She went to the local farmer's market. She set up a small table at the edge of the square. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered. The scent of the lavender acted like a siren song. People who hadn't seen a Vance in 30 years stopped in their tracks. "Is that real mountain purple?" an elderly woman asked, her eyes widening. "My grandmother used to grow this. I thought it died out during the Great Blight." "It's back," Martha said, her voice clear and caring across the cobblestones. "And it's growing at the Vance estate. We're opening a cooperative. No chemicals, no corporate patents, just the earth." By the time Sterling arrived with the county inspector and 2 black sedans, the narrative had already shifted. He didn't find a lonely old woman hiding in a ruin. He found a crowd of 20 locals, including the town's most influential elders, standing at the rusted gate, clutching bunches of lavender and jars of geothermal pressed oils. "What is this?" Sterling demanded, stepping out of the car, his face flushed with irritation. "This property is a public safety risk. Move aside." Martha stepped forward, a stack of photocopied documents in her hand. "Mr. Sterling, you're standing on a sovereign agricultural trust. Under the 1922 Homestead Act, which this deed is protected by, a functioning farm cannot be condemned for hazards without a federal audit. And, as you can see, we are very much in production." She handed the papers to the county inspector, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Check the dates, Henry. The taxes are current. The land is active, and these people are my witnesses." Sterling's eyes narrowed until they were just slits of blue ice. "You think a few flowers are going to stop a multi-billion-dollar development project? We'll tie you up in court until you're 90. "Maybe," Martha said. "But while you're doing that, the local news is already on their way. They seemed very interested in why a hazard produces the most valuable botanical specimens in the state. Sunlight is a very effective disinfectant, don't you think?" The immediate threat retreated, but Martha knew the victory was fragile. Sterling's lawyers would be back with an army. That night, she sat with Arthur in the kitchen, the warmth of the machine rising through the floorboards like a heartbeat. "You've poked the hornet's nest," Arthur said, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. "They won't use lawyers next time. They'll use a match." "Let them try," Martha said, but her hands were trembling. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving the cold reality of her age behind. She was tired. Her bones ached. "Why do you do it?" Arthur asked quietly. You could have taken the 100,000. You could be on a beach right now. Martha looked at the empty teacup on the table, the one she had found when she first arrived. Because for the first time in 65 years, I'm not waiting for someone to tell me where to go. I'm the one holding the map. Even if I only have 1 year left, or 10, or 20. I want those years to mean something. I want to be the one who kept the seeds alive. A loud thud echoed from the porch. Martha stood up, grabbing her heavy iron wrench. She approached the door, her heart hammering. She peered through the small viewing slit. It wasn't an assassin. It was a young girl, no older than 19, huddled in a thin jacket. She had a backpack that looked like it had seen 1,000 miles of road. She looked exactly like Martha felt when she first stepped off that bus, lost, terrified, and at the end of her rope. The girl looked up at the door, her eyes red from crying. Is this the place where things grow? Martha didn't hesitate. She turned the heavy iron key. The lock groaned, the door swung open, and for the first time, Martha Vance didn't just stand on the threshold. She invited someone across it. "Come in," Martha said, her voice thick with a new kind of strength. "We have a lot of work to do, and the machine is hungry." The girl's name was Ava. She was a runaway from the same system that had tried to swallow Martha. She had heard the rumors in the town about the Steel Widow and her magical garden. Over the next few months, the dynamic of the house shifted. Martha became the mind, Arthur remained the hands of the machine, and Ava became the future. They worked in a synchronized rhythm that defied the laws of the outside world. They bypassed the legal system by turning the property into a nonprofit educational trust. They brought in students, retirees, and outcasts. They turned the worthless mountainside into a fortress of biodiversity. Sterling's company eventually collapsed under the weight of a federal investigation, an investigation triggered by the documents Martha and her new community had organized. It turned out North Face Acquisitions had been erasing properties across 3 states. But for Martha, the corporate war was just background noise. On her 66th birthday, she stood on the porch, looking out over the mountain. The rusted gate was gone, replaced by a sturdy arch of reclaimed cedar. The air was filled with the scent of lavender and the sound of the machine's steady, comforting hum. She looked at her hands. They were scarred, grease-stained, and strong. She didn't look like a ghost anymore. She looked like a queen. She realized that her grandfather hadn't left her a building. He had left her a mirror. He had forced her to look past the rust of her own age to find the geothermal power that had been there all along. The lesson was simple, but it had taken her 65 years to learn it. Life doesn't end when the world stops looking at you. It begins when you finally stop looking for the world's approval and start building your own foundation. Martha Vance wasn't just surviving the winter. She was the one who had brought the spring. What in your life is currently rusted? What have you been told is worthless or too old to be salvaged? Perhaps it isn't a liability at all. Perhaps it's just waiting for the right key to turn the lock. Because as long as there is heat beneath the stone, there is a chance for a new empire to rise.